This video is going to cover the topic of graphing with variables. Be sure the date and topic are at the top of your page. The essential question that will guide this video is how do we graph dependent and independent variables? When we graph algebraic information, we need to always consider our variables. We probably remember from before that variables are things that can change. It's a quantity that can vary or change. And it's important to know, and it's important for the focus of this video, that there are two kinds of variables, dependent and independent variables. You've hopefully seen these terms and worked with these terms perhaps in science, but in math they are equally as important, and you need to know which variable is going to be on the x-axis and which is going to be on the y-axis of a graph when you're graphing algebraic information. You also want to know how these two variables are connected or related to one another. We'll start with the dependent variable. And the dependent variable is the one that is dependent upon or determined by the other. So for example, if you have a cell phone bill, the price that you pay on your cell phone depends on how much data you use, right? So this would be our dependent variable because it's dependent upon the other piece of information. That means that on the other hand, the independent variable is the opposite. It's the value that does the determining, right? It determines the other. So in our example before, right, the amount of data that you use determines how much you pay, right? So it is the determinant, it is the independent data. It doesn't matter, they are the one that's influencing it, so to speak, right? They're the ones that make the decision. The amount of data that you use determines how much money they charge you. In terms of graphing, these both belong in a particular place on the graph. The dependent variable goes on the y-axis, always. That is always our dependent variable. The independent variable is always on the x-axis. When we graph our variables, our graphs tell a story and it shows a relationship between two things. So it's important that we know what we're looking at by always knowing that our independent variable will be on our x-axis and our dependent variable will be on the y. Let's take a look at what this looks like in a graph by thinking about first an experiment with jumping jacks. In the experiment, we'll record the number of jumping jacks someone can do in 1 minute. When we're doing an experiment like this, we are recording two pieces of information. We're recording the time, the number of seconds that have passed, and the number of jumping jacks that the person has done. Normally I would probably write a little bit more information here in my table, but just for space sake, I'm just going to record it this way. I've filled in some made-up data here, and when we have this data or when we collect data, we want to be able to create a graph. A graph is a great visual representation of information. But to create this graph, we need to know which of these variables depends upon the other. That will tell us which one is going to go on the x-axis of a graph that we're going to draw and which will go on the y. So take a moment to think for yourself and decide which of these two variables is the independent and therefore goes on the x-axis and which is the dependent. Go ahead and write it in. We can always change it if we need to. The number of jumping jacks that we do depends on the time we spend doing them. That means that the number of jumping jacks is dependent and is the dependent variable and is on the y-axis. Time, therefore, is our determinant. It is independent of anything else. It will keep on moving regardless of how many jumping jacks we do. So it is our independent variable on the x-axis. And just as a general rule, when the measurement of time is used, it tells the story of something that's happening on our graph from left to right as time progresses. So it's almost always on the x-axis. So that's just something to keep in mind. But we have our graph set up now, and we have our x-axis as time and our y-axis as the number of jumping jacks. Always be sure to label your axes. We know from previous work with graphs that this is our origin. I'll just go ahead and remind you of that. And we also know we need to label the scale along the bottom. So the time in seconds goes from 0 to 60. I'm not going to count by ones. Instead, I think I'll count by tens, and I'm using the lines to do so. And I probably could have skipped lines here, but I'm just going to go ahead and keep it all right in there. My y values are my number of jacks, and that goes from 0 to 33. So I think here, using the lines, I'm going to use a scale of 5. Your scales don't have to be the same on both axes, but you just have to be consistent always on your one axis. So I'm counting by fives consistently. With our variables set and our scale set, we can now just go ahead and graph our coordinate points. The first one, of course, is 0, 0. Then at 10 seconds, we've done 5 jumping jacks. At 20, we've done 11, slightly more than 10. At 30 seconds, we did 16. 40 seconds was 22. 50 seconds was just 27. And 60 seconds was 33. We'll use this graph and the graphs that we do throughout this unit to find relationships between two things and to see the story that is told of that relationship. This video, however, was focused just on defining and using dependent and independent variables correctly. The essential question was how we can graph our independent and dependent variables, and we will continue to work on this throughout our algebra unit.